It was a calm evening when the streets were quiet, and the city lights reflected softly on the wet road after a light drizzle. A man named Harold Bennett was driving home from a charity dinner, where he had been invited as a guest speaker. He was dressed neatly in a dark suit, his tie loosened slightly, and a soft smile rested on his face as he thought about how the evening had gone. The dinner had been warm, filled with good conversations about justice, fairness, and the importance of treating every person with dignity. Harold always enjoyed moments like these. They reminded him of why he became a federal judge in the first place. As he drove through a small suburban neighborhood, his car moved at a slow and steady pace. The area was peaceful, the kind where families were already inside, and porch lights glowed like stars on the ground. He turned down a quiet street just minutes away from his home, humming lightly to the soft jazz playing on the radio. Then suddenly, he noticed flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought it must be an emergency vehicle passing by, so he pulled slightly to the side to give way. But when the siren blared louder and the lights grew closer, he realized they were for him. Confused, he slowed down and stopped completely. He checked the speedometer. He hadn't been speeding. His car registration and tags were valid. There was no reason to be pulled over. He sighed softly, rolled down his window, and waited as the two officers approached. He could see their flashlights cutting through the darkness, their hands already resting on their weapons. The first officer, tall and firm, shouted, "Step out of the vehicle. Keep your hands where I can see them." The sudden tone startled Harold. He raised his hand slightly, trying to stay calm. "Officer," he began, his voice steady, "is there a problem?" "Don't talk." "Step out of the vehicle now," the officer barked again. The second officer moved to the other side of the car, pointing the flashlight directly into Harold's face. It was blinding. Harold blinked and slowly opened the car door, keeping his hands visible the whole time. He stepped out carefully, the cool air hitting his face. He tried to stay respectful, remembering his own advice to others, always remain calm during a police stop. But something about the officer's aggression didn't feel right. They were acting as if he were a dangerous criminal. "Put your hands on the hood," the first officer shouted. "Now!" Harold hesitated for a second, trying to explain. "Officer, I said now." The man froze, then slowly placed his hands on the hood of his car. The metal was still warm. One of the officers moved closer, gripping his gun tightly, his eyes full of suspicion. The other officer began checking Harold's pockets roughly. "What are you doing in this area?" he demanded. "I live just a few blocks away," Harold answered calmly. "I was coming from a charity event." The officer laughed under his breath. "A charity event? At this hour?" "Yes," Harold replied quietly. "You can check my identification in the car. It's in the glove compartment." The first officer didn't respond. Instead, he muttered something to his partner, and both of them stepped back a little, still aiming their flashlights at him. One whispered, "This guy fits the description of the suspect from earlier." Harold's heart pounded. He didn't know what suspect they were talking about, but the situation was turning from confusing to frightening. He lifted his head slightly, trying to keep eye contact without appearing confrontational. "Officers, please," he said softly. "I think there's been a mistake. I'm not who you're looking for." "Quiet," the officer yelled. "Hands where I can see them." The tension in the air was thick. The night was so still that the only sounds were the distant hum of streetlights and Harold's slow breathing. He could feel the eyes of neighbors behind their curtains watching silently. In a matter of minutes, his calm drive home had turned into a scene of public humiliation. He stood there, the cold air biting his face, while one of the officers called for backup. The second officer kept his weapon half raised, as if expecting Harold to make a sudden move. Harold remained still. Years of courtroom experience had taught him patience, but this was different. It wasn't justice he was feeling. It was fear. A few minutes later, another police car arrived. The sergeant, an older man with gray hair, stepped out. He looked at Harold, then at the officers. "What's going on here?" he asked. "Possible suspect, sir," the first officer replied. "Matches the description of a stolen vehicle case." The sergeant frowned. "Did you run his plates?" "Not yet, sir. He was acting suspiciously." "I wasn't acting suspiciously," Harold said quietly. "I simply asked why I was being stopped." The sergeant turned to him. "Sir, do you have any identification?" "Yes," Harold replied. It's inside my car in the glove compartment. The sergeant nodded to one of the officers who reluctantly went to check. After a moment, he returned holding Harold's wallet and ID. He looked confused as he handed it to the sergeant. The sergeant's eyes widened when he saw the name and credentials. Federal Judge Harold Bennett, he read aloud. The tone in his voice shifted completely. The street fell silent. The two officers froze, realizing the weight of their mistake. The sergeant exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Sir," he said quietly, I'm so sorry. There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Harold didn't speak for a few seconds. He looked at the two officers who had aimed their weapons at him moments ago. Their faces had gone pale and they couldn't meet his eyes. Slowly, he straightened his jacket and brushed the dirt off his sleeves. His voice was calm but cold when he finally spoke. "A misunderstanding," he repeated softly. "Do you often point guns at people during misunderstandings?" "Sir, we didn't know who you were," one of the officers started. "That's exactly the problem," Harold interrupted. "You didn't care who I was until you saw this card." The sergeant tried to apologize again, but Harold lifted a hand. "No," he said firmly. "You've already done enough." He took his ID back and turned toward his car. The neighborhood was silent. Lights were on in several houses now, and a few people were standing on their porches watching. Harold opened the car door slowly, sat inside, and took a deep breath. His hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. For a long moment, he didn't start the engine. He just sat there, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The disbelief, the anger, and the sadness all mixed inside him. He had spent years upholding the law, protecting fairness, and teaching young lawyers about justice yet tonight, he had been treated like a criminal because of what he looked like. Finally, he started the car and drove away. The flashing lights faded in the distance, but the memory of that moment burned deep in his mind. As he turned into his driveway, he saw his porch light still glowing, a warm welcome after a cold encounter. He sat for a few minutes before stepping out, trying to collect himself. When he entered his house, the silence felt heavier than usual. He loosened his tie and sat down in the living room. The same man who spent his life believing in law and order now found himself questioning how fragile justice could be in the wrong hands. That night, Harold couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the flashlights, the drawn weapons, and the disbelief on the officers' faces when they discovered who he was. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had gone through the same thing but didn't have the title or position to be heard. As dawn broke, Harold made himself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching the soft sunlight touch the rooftops. The city was waking up, unaware of what had happened just hours before. He made a quiet promise to himself. This wouldn't end with an apology. Something needed to change. He didn't know yet what that change would look like, but deep inside, he knew this night was only the beginning of something much larger, and for the first time in a long while, the man who had always believed in justice began to see the cracks in the very system he served. The next morning, Harold woke up earlier than usual. The memory of the night before was still fresh in his mind, like a heavy weight pressing on his chest. The moment he opened his eyes, he could almost hear the echo of those police commands, sharp and cold, as if they were still standing outside his car. He sat at the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the floor, feeling a strange mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. He had faced difficult cases in court before, cases involving injustice, unfair treatment, and abuse of power, but he never imagined that one day he would experience that same injustice himself. He went to the kitchen and made himself a cup of coffee. The smell filled the room, but it didn't bring comfort like it usually did. As he sipped slowly, he stared out the window. The neighborhood looked peaceful, as if nothing had happened. Birds were perched on the trees. The morning sun painted everything golden, and children were walking to school with their parents. But inside Harold's mind, it was far from peaceful. He kept replaying the moment when the officers had pointed their weapons at him, when they had treated him like a criminal without even asking a question. He remembered the fear in his chest and the humiliation he felt as the neighbors watched from their windows. For a man who had spent his entire life believing in the rule of law, that moment had changed something deep inside him. Later that morning, Harold received a call from his assistant at the courthouse. Her voice was polite as always, but she sounded worried. "Sir, are you okay? I saw something on social media. Someone posted a video of what happened last night." "A video?" Harold asked, surprised. Yes, she said softly. Someone was recording the whole thing from their window. It's already spreading online. People are talking about it. Harold closed his eyes for a moment. He hadn't even realized someone had filmed the scene. He thanked her and hung up, then opened his laptop. It didn't take long to find the video. There he was, standing beside his car, hands in the air, surrounded by flashing lights and raised weapons. The video showed the entire incident, including the moment when the sergeant discovered who he was. The clip ended with Harold getting back into his car, silent and visibly shaken. The comments under the video were overflowing. Some people were shocked and angry, calling for the officers to be fired. Others couldn't believe a federal judge had been treated that way. There were even people who tried to defend the officers, saying they were just doing their job. But most comments expressed outrage and sadness. People wrote things like, "If this can happen to a judge, imagine what happens to regular folks." By afternoon, news outlets had already picked up the story. Headlines appeared everywhere. Federal judge wrongly detained by police during traffic stop. Reporters were camping outside the courthouse, hoping to get a statement. Harold didn't want to speak to them yet. He needed time to process everything. When he arrived at the courthouse later that day, everyone looked at him differently. Some of his colleagues stopped him in the hallway, shaking their heads in disbelief. One of the younger clerks said quietly, "Sir, I'm so sorry. What they did was wrong." Harold nodded, offering a small, tired smile. "Thank you," he said. "I'll be fine," but he wasn't fine. Every step he took through the building felt heavier than usual. This was the same courthouse where he had defended fairness for years, where he had made decisions that affected people's lives. Now he walked through those halls feeling like the very system he believed in had failed him. At lunch, Harold sat alone in his office looking out at the city. His phone kept buzzing with calls and messages from journalists, friends, and even other judges. He ignored most of them. What could he say? He didn't want to make a public statement out of anger. He knew that whatever he said would matter, and he wanted to choose his words carefully. That evening, when he finally returned home, there were cameras outside his gate. Reporters called out his name asking for comments. "Judge Bennett, do you plan to press charges? Do you believe the officers were racially motivated? How do you feel after what happened?" He simply raised a hand politely and said, "No comments for now." Then he entered his house and closed the door behind him. The silence inside felt comforting. He sat down in his living room exhausted. The television was on, and one of the news channels was covering his story. Seeing himself on screen like that felt strange, almost unreal. As the reporter spoke, the clip of the incident replayed again and again. Each time he saw the guns pointed at him, he felt that same chill in his spine. The reporter mentioned that the police department had issued a short public statement, saying they deeply regretted the misunderstanding and that the officers had been temporarily suspended pending an internal review. Harold sighed. A misunderstanding, that word again. It sounded so small, so casual, as if what happened was just a simple mistake. But he knew better. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was judgment without knowledge. It was fear disguised as authority. The next morning, his phone rang again. This time it was a friend from law school, now a well-known civil rights attorney. "I saw the video, Harold," his friend said. "I know you don't like drama, but you can't stay quiet about this. You have a platform. People will listen to you." "I know," Harold replied softly, "but I need to think this through. I don't want this to turn into something political. It's about something much deeper." "That's exactly why you should speak," his friend insisted. "If someone like you doesn't talk about it, who will?" After hanging up, Harold sat in silence for a while. His friend was right. Maybe this was bigger than him. Maybe this was a chance to bring real change. But part of him still felt tired, emotionally drained. He wasn't ready to face the public storm yet. As days passed, the story grew bigger. News anchors discussed it every night. Commentators debated the issue of racial bias in policing. Civil rights organizations demanded action. The pressure on the police department increased. Finally, after nearly a week, Harold decided to break his silence. He called for a brief press conference outside the courthouse. When he arrived, cameras and microphones filled the space. The crowd fell quiet as he stepped up to the podium. He took a deep breath before speaking. "Good afternoon," he began. His voice was calm but steady. "Many of you have asked how I feel about what happened. The truth is, I feel disappointed. not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been treated unfairly without reason." He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. "I've spent most of my life believing that justice is blind, that everyone is treated equally under the law. But last week I learned that isn't always true. I was mistaken for someone else, treated as a threat and humiliated in front of my community. I'm not here to seek sympathy. I'm here to ask for accountability." Reporters began scribbling notes as he continued. "I have great respect for law enforcement officers who risk their lives every day. But respect must go both ways. When power is used carelessly, it destroys trust. And when trust is gone, justice cannot survive." His words were simple but powerful. There was no anger in his tone, only quiet conviction. "I will not pursue personal revenge," he said. "But I will ask for a thorough investigation and for reforms to ensure this doesn't happen again. Not to me, not to anyone." When he finished, the crowd broke into murmurs. Some clapped softly. Cameras flashed as he turned away from the microphones and walked back into the courthouse. That short speech spread everywhere within hours. News stations replayed it, and people on social media praised his calm strength. But even though the world saw a man standing tall, inside, Harold still felt the scars. Every time he drove past a police car, he felt his stomach tighten. Every time someone said it was just a mistake, it reopened the wound. That night after the press conference, he sat on his porch watching the stars. The air was cool, and for the first time in a while, he felt a bit of peace. He knew the coming days would be difficult. The investigations, the politics, the attention. But he also knew that silence wasn't an option anymore. The world had seen what happened, but more importantly, they had listened to him. And for Harold, that was the beginning of something that could finally bring meaning to the pain he had endured. The morning after Harold's public statement, his phone didn't stop ringing. Reporters wanted interviews, civil rights groups wanted to meet him, and countless strangers were sending messages of support. He read through some of them while having breakfast, still trying to understand how quickly his life had changed. Just a week ago, he was known as a calm, fair judge who lived a quiet life. Now he had become a symbol of something much bigger, a reminder that no one was safe from unfair treatment, no matter how respected or educated they were. When he stepped outside that morning, he noticed a few neighbors standing near their lawns. Some waved at him, offering supportive smiles. Others looked nervous, unsure of what to say. One older woman from across the street called out softly, "We saw everything that night. We're so sorry you had to go through that." Harold gave her a gentle nod. "Thank you," he said. "I just hope something good can come out of it." He drove to the courthouse trying to focus on his work, but it was nearly impossible. Everywhere he went, people were talking about the incident. In the elevator, two clerks whispered about the viral video before noticing he was standing behind them. They turned red and quickly fell silent. Harold gave a polite smile and stepped out without saying anything. In his office, stacks of letters had been delivered, handwritten notes from strangers, law students, retired police officers, and even other judges. Many expressed support and admiration for how calmly he had handled the situation. Some shared their own painful experiences of being mistreated. Reading through them, Harold felt a deep connection to people he had never met. He realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. His story had opened a door that others had been afraid to push. It gave voice to people who had suffered quietly for years. By afternoon, news channels were still covering his press conference. The video of his speech had been replayed countless times, and social media was filled with hashtags calling for justice and police accountability. The city police department faced heavy criticism. Protesters gathered outside the station holding signs that read, "Justice for all, and no more excuses." The officers involved in Harold's case were placed on administrative leave, but that didn't calm the public. People wanted transparency. They wanted answers. Inside the police department, things were tense. Many officers felt frustrated that two of their own had caused such a scandal. Others quietly admitted that something needed to change. The chief of police held a press briefing, promising a full investigation and apologizing publicly to Harold. "We respect Judge Bennett deeply," the chief said. "What happened was unacceptable, and we are taking it seriously." Harold watched the briefing from his office. He could see that the chief's words were careful, almost rehearsed. He appreciated the apology but knew it wasn't enough. Apologies didn't fix broken systems. That evening, as he was leaving the courthouse, a small group of reporters caught up with him again. One of them asked, "Judge Bennett, do you think this is an issue of race or poor training?" He paused for a moment before replying, "I think it's about attitude. When people carry power, they must also carry humility. Without it, power becomes dangerous." His calm but firm response made headlines again. He never raised his voice, never used harsh words, but his message was clear. Later that night, Harold sat at his desk at home writing in his notebook. It was something he often did when his mind was full. He wrote about what justice meant to him, not the kind written in law books, but the kind that lived in people's hearts. He wrote about fairness, empathy, and how small decisions could have big consequences. He stopped writing when he heard his phone buzz again. It was a message from a news anchor inviting him to appear on a live television interview. He wasn't sure if he wanted to do that. Public attention wasn't something he enjoyed, but part of him knew this was bigger than his comfort. He replied, agreeing to appear the next evening. When the day came, Harold dressed neatly and arrived at the television studio. The host greeted him warmly and led him to the stage. The lights were bright and the cameras pointed at him, but he stayed calm. During the interview, the host asked, "Judge Bennett, what do you hope will come from all of this?" He thought for a moment and said, "I don't want revenge. I want reflection. I want people to ask themselves what kind of society we are building. Are we teaching respect or fear? Are we protecting rights or just defending power?" The host nodded slowly, clearly moved by his words. The interview aired nationwide that night. Many viewers said they felt inspired by his calm wisdom. It reminded people that real strength doesn't come from anger, but from purpose. In the following days, things started moving quickly. The federal government announced an independent review of the police department. Investigators were assigned to look into the department's record, including past complaints against officers. It didn't take long for troubling patterns to surface. Several previous complaints of racial profiling had been dismissed without proper review. When Harold heard about it, he wasn't surprised, only saddened. He had seen corruption before, but it hurt more this time because it hit so close to home. Meanwhile, the two officers involved in his case tried to defend themselves. Their lawyers claimed they had acted based on a reasonable suspicion, but the public wasn't convinced. The video showed clearly that Harold had done nothing wrong. The protests grew larger. They were peaceful, but the message was powerful. People were tired of excuses. Students, teachers, doctors, and even some police officers joined the demonstrations. One evening, as Harold was walking to his car after work, a young man approached him. He looked nervous but determined. "Sir," he said, "I just wanted to thank you. My brother went through something similar last year." Nobody believed him. "But now, because of you, people are finally listening." Harold smiled softly and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "You don't owe me thanks," he said. "Just promise me something. Don't lose faith in justice. It's slow, but it works when people keep fighting for it." The young man nodded, his eyes filled with emotion, and walked away. That brief encounter stayed in Harold's heart long after. It reminded him why he couldn't back down now. As days turned into weeks, the pressure on the police department increased. The mayor called for a citywide forum where citizens could express their concerns directly to officials. Harold was invited to attend as a special guest. The forum was held in a large hall filled with hundreds of people. When Harold arrived, the crowd applauded softly, showing respect rather than excitement. The mayor opened the session, promising change and better accountability. Then, one by one, community members stood up to speak. A mother who feared for her teenage son, a teacher who had witnessed discrimination, a retired officer who admitted the system had flaws. When it was Harold's turn, he stood slowly and looked around the room. "We are not here to tear anyone down," he began. "We are here to build something stronger. Justice doesn't need sides. It only needs honesty." The room was silent as he continued. "We can't fix the past, but we can shape the future. It starts with listening, truly listening, and making sure power is never used to humiliate or harm the innocent." When he sat down, the audience rose to their feet, applauding quietly but meaningfully. The mayor promised that the city would begin immediate reforms, including new training programs and stricter oversight policies. That night, Harold drove home feeling a strange mix of hope and exhaustion. The fight was far from over, but something had changed. For the first time in a long while, people were paying attention not just to what had happened to him, but to what was happening everywhere. When he reached home, he turned off the car engine and sat quietly for a few moments. He looked at the same street where he had been stopped weeks ago. It was calm now, with children playing in the distance and porch lights glowing softly. He thought about how quickly things can change, how one night of injustice could turn into a movement for truth. Then he whispered to himself, "This isn't the end. It's only the beginning." He stepped out of his car and walked inside, the cool air brushing against his face. That night, for the first time since the incident, he slept peacefully, not because everything was fixed, but because he finally felt that his pain had a purpose. The sun had barely risen when Harold sat by his window, watching the city slowly come to life. The morning was quiet, but his mind was restless. The days following the public forum had been a whirlwind. Reporters, officials, and strangers kept reaching out to him. Some wanted his advice, others wanted his approval. Everyone had something to say. But what he really needed was a moment to breathe. He had never imagined his life would take this turn. For most of his career, he had lived behind the bench, calm, steady, and neutral. He had always believed that his role was to observe, not to become part of the story. But now he was in the center of it. His name had become a symbol, and people were looking at him not just as a judge, but as a voice for justice itself. It was a heavy weight to carry, yet he knew he couldn't step back now. That morning, as he sipped his coffee, he received a call from the mayor's office. They informed him that the federal investigation into the police department had officially begun. Agents would be reviewing years of records, complaints, reports, and officer conduct logs. It was a step Harold had been waiting for, though he knew it would uncover things that many people would rather keep buried. Later that day, Harold went to the courthouse as usual, trying to focus on his work. But as soon as he entered the building, he could sense the shift. People treated him differently now, with more respect, yes, but also with a kind of cautious admiration. Some greeted him warmly, others avoided him, perhaps unsure how to act around a man who had become both a victim and a national figure. When he entered his office, there was another stack of letters waiting for him. One caught his eye. It was from a retired police officer. The handwriting was neat, the tone humble. "I served on the force for 30 years, the letter read. I saw things I should have spoken up about. What happened to you reminded me of all the times I stayed quiet. I'm sorry for that." Harold folded the letter carefully and placed it in his drawer. It was one of the few messages that touched him deeply. It reminded him that change didn't always start with anger. Sometimes it began with honesty. That afternoon, he was invited to attend a meeting between city officials, police representatives, and the federal investigators. The meeting was closed to the public, but it was a turning point. The conference room was filled with tension. On one side sat police leaders, their faces stiff and serious. On the other side sat the investigators and city officials. Harold took a seat quietly at the end of the table, not as a judge, but as a citizen whose experience had started this process. One of the investigators began the meeting. "We're here to determine not just what happened that night," she said, "but what's been happening for years." As files were opened and documents were shared, the truth began to unfold. Dozens of complaints had been ignored, buried under paperwork or dismissed as misunderstandings. Officers with long histories of misconduct were still on active duty. Supervisors had looked the other way. It was a painful sight, one that left the room heavy with silence. The chief of police cleared his throat and said, "We've made mistakes, but our department serves with integrity. These incidents don't represent who we are." Harold watched him closely. The chief's words were polished, but his eyes showed discomfort. Harold didn't interrupt, but his calm presence seemed to make others uneasy. After all, it was his story that had forced them to face this truth. At the end of the meeting, one of the investigators turned to Harold and asked, "Judge Bennett, you've seen both sides of the law, from behind the bench and as someone who's been wronged by it. What, in your opinion, needs to change first?" Harold took a moment before answering. His voice was soft but clear. "Accountability," he said. "You can't fix what you refuse to see. Laws can't work if those enforcing them don't respect them. Every complaint should be treated like a mirror. You might not like what you see, but it shows you the truth." The room was quiet. No one argued. The words carried too much weight to be ignored. After the meeting ended, several officials approached him privately to thank him for his honesty. Some even admitted that his experience had made them reconsider their own attitudes toward authority. But Harold wasn't looking for praise. He was looking for progress. As he walked out of the building, he noticed a few journalists waiting nearby. They shouted questions, asking what had been discussed inside. He simply replied, "The truth. And the truth will always find its way out." Then he walked away, his calm steps carrying more meaning than any speech could. Over the next few weeks, the investigation gained momentum. The media followed every development, and the public's interest only grew stronger. For the first time, people were paying attention to details that had been ignored for years. Community meetings were organized across the city. Residents shared their experiences, many revealing that they had been afraid to speak before. Harold attended several of those meetings, often sitting quietly in the audience. He listened more than he spoke. He wanted people to feel heard. He noticed how voices that had once been silent were now finding strength. It gave him hope. One evening, after a long day, Harold received a call from one of the federal investigators. "Judge Bennett, I thought you should know," the agent said. "We've uncovered internal emails from the precinct that confirm your suspicions. There were deliberate attempts to hide certain complaints." Harold closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a wave of sadness. He thanked the investigator and hung up. It wasn't satisfaction he felt. It was sorrow for how easily truth had been buried under fear and pride. The next day, the news broke. The leaked findings spread across every major channel. The city erupted in discussions and debates. The police department tried to control the damage, but the public had already made up its mind. Trust had been broken. The mayor called Harold personally. "We're going to rebuild the department from the ground up," the mayor said. "You started something we can't turn away from now." "I didn't start it," Harold replied quietly. "It was always there. We just stopped pretending not to see it." A few days later, Harold was invited to speak at a national law conference. He hesitated at first. He wasn't looking for fame or recognition, but he realized his story could inspire change far beyond his city. Standing on the stage before hundreds of lawyers, judges, and policymakers, Harold began his speech with humility. "I'm not here as a victim," he said. "I'm here as someone who believes we can do better. I've always believed that justice is more than punishment. It's about trust. When that trust is broken, justice becomes just a word." The audience listened closely as he spoke about compassion, about treating people not as suspects, but as human beings. He shared how one night had changed his view of the law forever, not by destroying his faith in it, but by reminding him how fragile it could be. When he finished, the hall was silent for a moment before erupting in applause. People stood, not just to honor his story, but to acknowledge a truth they could no longer ignore. Afterward, several young law students approached him. One of them said, "Your story reminded me why I wanted to study law in the first place. I want to be part of the change." Harold smiled gently. "Then do it," he said. "Change doesn't start in offices or courts. It starts in hearts." That night, as he returned home, Harold sat once again by his window. The city lights glowed softly the same way they had on that night weeks ago, the night that changed everything. But this time he didn't feel the same weight in his chest. Instead, he felt calm, even grateful. He thought about the people he'd met, the stories he'd heard, and the voices that had finally been set free. He realized that sometimes life has a strange way of forcing you to live your beliefs instead of just speaking them. Before going to bed, he looked at the file on his desk, a report of the investigation's progress. There was still a long road ahead, many problems yet to fix. But for the first time, Harold felt that the city was moving in the right direction. He turned off the light and whispered to himself, "Justice isn't perfect, but it's worth fighting for." Then he closed his eyes, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that one act of courage had started something no one could stop. It had been a few months since the investigation began, and the city had slowly started to change. People talked differently now. The fear that once made them whisper was turning into something else, something stronger, something that sounded like hope. But behind all the public progress, Harold's life had grown quieter. He still went to work every morning, still walked into his courtroom with his calm, steady steps. Yet there was a different kind of silence in his life now, a silence filled with reflection. He often thought about that night, The flashing lights, the harsh commands, the sound of his own breath as he faced the officers who didn't see a judge, only a target. It felt like a lifetime ago, yet the memory remained sharp like a scar that refused to fade. Some nights he'd wake up suddenly, the scene replaying in his mind. But instead of anger, he felt a strange kind of sadness. He wasn't broken by it. He was simply changed. The investigation had turned up shocking details. Several officers had been suspended, and a few were facing charges for misconduct. The department's leadership had been shaken to its core. A new acting police chief was appointed. A calm, determined woman who had served for over 20 years but had never been given the chance to lead. She met Harold privately soon after her appointment. "Judge Bennett," she said as they sat across from each other, "I can't erase what happened, but I want to make sure it never happens again. We need to build something honest, something real." Harold nodded. "That's all I ever wanted," he said. "Not revenge, just truth." The two of them spoke for hours that day, discussing reforms, training programs, and the need to rebuild trust between officers and the people they served. She listened carefully, and for the first time Harold felt that someone within the system truly understood what needed to change. But not everyone was happy about the direction things were going. Some officers who had been with the department for years felt threatened by the changes. They saw the reforms as an attack, not a correction. Rumors began to spread, quietly at first, then louder. Some said Harold had used his position to destroy careers. Others claimed he was seeking fame. None of it was true, but lies have a way of traveling faster than truth. Harold heard the whispers, but he didn't let them break his calm. He'd faced worse storms in life. He focused on the work, on helping the reform committee draft new policies, on mentoring young law students who came to him for guidance. Still, deep down, he knew that the story wasn't over. Change never came without resistance. One afternoon, he was walking out of the courthouse when a man approached him. The man looked nervous, his uniform wrinkled, his hands trembling slightly. "Sir," he said, "I'm with the department. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened to you. Not all of us are like that." Harold looked at him with gentle eyes. "I know," he replied, "and I don't hold hatred for anyone. But what matters now is what you do moving forward." The young officer nodded. "That's why I joined the new training program. We're learning about how to de-escalate, how to see people differently. I never realized how much fear and power could twist things." Harold smiled faintly. Learning is the first step toward healing. Moments like that reminded him that progress was possible, even if it came slowly. Weeks passed and the investigation reached its final phase. The findings were set to be released to the public. The anticipation was heavy. Everyone wanted to know how deep the corruption went and who would be held accountable. The night before the report was made public, Harold received an invitation to attend the press conference. He didn't want the spotlight, but he knew it was important to be there, not for himself, but for what his presence represented. The next morning, the hall was packed with reporters, cameras, and officials. The air was tense. When the federal lead investigator took the podium, the room fell silent. She began to read from the report. Years of overlooked misconduct, evidence of racial bias, and a culture of silence that had protected the guilty while punishing the brave. The truth was painful, but it was clear. As she finished, she looked out into the crowd. This case began because one man stood up and chose not to remain silent. His courage forced us all to confront what we had ignored for too long. Change doesn't start in the system, it starts in people. All eyes turned toward Harold. He sat still, his hands folded. He didn't smile, didn't wave. He simply nodded once, acknowledging the moment with quiet grace. After the conference, reporters rushed toward him. Questions flew from every direction. "Judge Bennett, how do you feel about the findings?" one asked. "Do you believe justice has been done?" Harold paused before answering. "Justice is not a destination," he said softly. "It's a road we keep walking. Today is one step, but there's still a long way to go." His words spread quickly, quoted in newspapers and shared across social media. But while the world celebrated progress, Harold went home to his small, quiet apartment. He sat by the window as the evening light faded, watching the city skyline glow. He thought of all the people who had come forward, all the stories that had been buried and finally brought to light. For the first time in months, he felt something close to peace. A few days later, he received a letter in the mail. It had no return address. The handwriting was uneven, shaky. Inside it read, "You don't know me, but my brother was one of the officers involved." He lost his job because of what you exposed. I was angry at first, but then I read your story. I realized he was wrong, and maybe losing that badge saved him. Thank you for showing him what accountability really means." Harold set the letter down and stared at it for a long time. It was a reminder that truth had ripples. It didn't just punish, it also healed in unexpected ways. Around the same time, he began to receive invitations to speak at schools, community centers, and law conferences. He didn't say yes to most of them, but when he did speak, he spoke simply. "Justice isn't about power," he'd tell the audience. "It's about responsibility, about looking at someone and seeing their humanity before anything else." People would often come up afterward, thanking him for his honesty. Some even moved to tears. It wasn't the applause he cared about. It was the feeling that little by little people were beginning to understand. Despite the positive changes, the backlash never completely disappeared. Some people still blamed him for tarnishing the department's name. Others accused him of exaggeration, but Harold didn't argue with them. He had learned that not everyone would see the same truth, and that was okay. His job wasn't to convince the world. It was to live by his conscience. One evening, while leaving the courthouse, he saw two officers helping an elderly man across the street. It was a small thing, but it made Harold smile. For years, he had seen the law as a tool of order, but now he saw it as a reflection of character. The difference between good and bad wasn't in the badge or the robe, it was in the heart. Later that night, he received a call from the new police chief. "I thought you should know," she said. "We just completed the first training cycle under the new reforms. It's working. Officers are seeing people differently now. We're not perfect, but we're trying." "That's all anyone can ask," Harold said warmly. "Trying is where change begins." When he hung up, he leaned back in his chair, feeling an unfamiliar lightness. The city outside buzzed with life, the sound of cars, laughter, and distant sirens that no longer made his heart race. The pain of what happened had not disappeared, but it had turned into something useful, something meaningful. He knew there would always be challenges, always be people who resisted the truth, but there would also be those who learned, who grew, who stood up when it mattered. And that, he thought, was enough. Before going to bed, Harold looked at his reflection in the mirror. The lines on his face seemed deeper now, the years etched in quiet dignity. He smiled faintly and whispered to himself, "This isn't the end, it's the beginning of something better." Then he turned off the light, ready for the next chapter of his life, knowing that even in the hardest moments, doing the right thing had been worth it.